I'm going to cover some different themes in the session. I'm going to set the scene. I'm going to tell you a bit about CAST and Catalyst in case you don't know. I'll skim through that pretty quickly because looking at the people who are here, I think most of you know that. We'll talk a tiny bit about the work that we're doing with the National Lottery that's supported by the Lottery. And then we'll quickly talk about what we know about reuse and why it's an important thing to do. We'll talk about the sort of like the programs that we've either got live or that we're just about to launch around reuse. And then we'll have a quick break for some Q&A. Then we'll talk about how we hope to create software that's designed for reuse in mind. We'll talk a bit about licensing and working in the open and the support that we have for charities and development organisations working on our programs. And then we'll do a quick little breakout exercise, which Cecilia has prepared a lovely question for us all. So before we get started, for anyone here who's a charity, I know there are lots of pressures on your time. And actually one thing that we hear when we talk to charities is that we'd love to create something that's reusable and will benefit the wider sector, but it's tough because it's not necessarily everyone's priority and time and money is already tight. I just want to say that I'd like to acknowledge that here, and hopefully you'll see that we're thinking about that and we're thinking about how we can create interventions that don't take up too much time, but hopefully you'll also see the benefit of what it is that we hope to achieve through this. So very succinctly, CAST is a charity. It helps organisations to create better solutions for their service users through the use of digital data and design. It hopes through its work to create a more resilient and responsive sector. And Catalyst is sort of the scale up in a way from CAST, where it's aiming to take on the problems of civic sector at large and to try and look at how to create solutions at scale and solutions that will use the economies of scale. And the part of Catalyst that I look after is around reuse. So I'll briefly introduce the funding that's happening at the moment in case those of you haven't seen it. So we're very grateful. The National Lottery Community Fund has given us a fund to deliver to charities and to digital agencies to support those charities. I'm not going to read out the long title. I think all of you can manage that one, but I'm going to give you a few quick stats. So far, 100 charities along with 11 digital partners have gone through a discovery program together. They've been through a 4-week program and they've learned a lot about the solutions and that they want to develop and the problems that their users are having that they want to solve for them. In addition to that, 11 charities and digital partners are already working together on solutions. Those are organisations who had already done their discovery work and so came straight into that development programme. And there are now 18 of the charities from Discovery who've successfully applied for development funding, and those charities will be matched with a partner. Now, the really exciting bit and why we're talking about at scale is that each of these organisations has committed to share their learning with a network of another 10 civic society organisations. So you can see already that we're trying to wire reuse and sharing and openness into all the programmes from the very get-go. So I mentioned that I look after the reuse part of Catalyst. It's got two sort of side missions with it. So one is around standards and tools, and one is around capacity, and they're all interrelated, and reuse is the central thing. So we are very grateful to lots of you who are digital suppliers who are on the call today. We wish there were a lot more of you and a lot more like you, because the charity sector, as it scales up its digital ambitions, is going to need many more suppliers, and that's what we mean by capacity. One thing we know is that we can't scale the number of good suppliers and the number of digital specialists that quickly. We've got lots of ideas about how we'll do it, and we've got lots of organisations who are joining us on a very regular basis. One thing that we can do to scale up is to actually reduce the amount of work, and that's where reuse comes in. That's where standards and tools come in. If we're using standards, if we're using open standards in particular, it means that software is far more interoperable and more people understand how to work with it and how to work with the data that's contained within it. If we're doing things with reuse, if charities are sharing what they've done and other charities can pick it up and use it, then actually we'll need less of the capacity. It's not to say we don't want you, we just know that there aren't enough of you out there. And so what we're trying to do is to reduce the amount of work that needs to be done. And in particular, we're trying to reduce the unnecessary duplication that we know occurs. So what do we mean by reuse? Well, reuse is really simple. It's when one organization uses a tool, a service, or a process, or a standard, or anything else that's been developed by another organization. And in particular, we love reuse to be where people are adapting the thing. So they're remixing it, they're adding their additional knowledge about their users and their needs, expectations, and behaviors, and they're improving it in some ways. And so actually getting other organizations using these reusable solutions actually makes everything better. Where does reuse fit? Well, a few years ago, CAST published some digital design principles, and actually it's number 2 in there. It's about understanding what's out there first and understanding if you can reuse it, whether it will work for your audience. There's some interesting research we've done with an organization called the Engine Room around reuse. And the thing that we found by working with them was that actually reuse can help kickstart the digital confidence of an organization. So reuse increases the confidence of the team members involved, and it actually acts as a key to get into a community of practitioners and helps introduce you to organizations working on similar challenges. And what we really hope is through greater reuse that we'll have a lot of little communities of practice build up, as they already do, but around digital practice, around particular tools. So why would you reuse? Well, it's pretty obvious in lots of cases that it just saves money, it's quicker to implement. But the interesting ones that you might not necessarily have thought about are that it actually reduces risk. So creating bespoke software, I'm a software engineer, is inherently risky. There are always bits that you maybe don't have enough time to do. Reusing stuff actually creates a system where you've got many eyes looking at the code, or if you're reusing a commercial product, you've got a large development team who are working on that product, and you're effectively leveraging their investment in it. A really lovely quote from Catalyst launch from Julie Bishop of Law Centers Network is really the thing that I keep coming back to really regularly. And she said, we want the money for people to fund hardware. We still want that. We also want somebody to fund a cataloging tool. And I'm going to talk a tiny bit about our work that we're doing on that. And she says that we can find out who's doing what. And then importantly, I think she says, then I'll only use our money to do what we alone have the expertise to do. And there are so many experts out in civic society who have very precise and very specific expertise. And what we hope that they will do is share how they solve problems so that other people with lesser expertise can pick them up. And if we do this as a whole, then actually we'll start to build a lovely fabric of reusable things that will cover as much of civic society as we can. And this is described in this rather inelegant diagram that we jokingly called the blob model in the early days of thinking about stuff at Catalyst, which is there are loads of things out there in the world already. You know, if you want to sell something, there's things like Shopify. If you want to deal with regular giving, there are platforms that do that. There are CRMs everywhere. There are really good publishing tools and really good search tools. And actually, if you sort of put all these things together a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, and you reuse all of those bits, then actually what you'll find is you have a lot more time, money, and effort putting into the thing that makes your charity really unique, which is the delivery of a service to your users. And that service may include other bits of reuse as well. But hopefully, you know, by breaking it up into lots of different activities, we can start to see reuse on the things that are what Amazon likes to call undifferentiated heavy lifting. So things that other people have done before you. So why don't we reuse currently? Mostly it's around people not knowing what's out there. A lot of it is people not necessarily having the time to find things to reuse, and that's why a catalogue's important. There are some things around not understanding if you're allowed to reuse it, and hopefully we can change that by creating some things in the world that say, please take this. And then a lot of it is around understanding how to relate it to the needs, expectations, and behaviors of users. And actually, we'll talk a bit about service recipes in a bit, which is one of our first attempts to really try and work on this. And service recipes are one of these objects of reuse that we're going to talk about. But I wonder, are there any questions at this stage that anyone's had so far?
I'm just trying to keep up on what's in the chat. I think we might want to. There's two questions. I'm not quite sure if you'll answer them. Maybe you'll answer them in the next session, Chris, but I'll share them here. How to bake in principles of reuse from Rachel. So for whenever you're developing, like, how do you make sure that you have that in mind? And Jonathan asked, how can charities be supported to build and use more open tech?
Brilliant. Well, we'll definitely be covering those in the next bit. I just thought we'd have a quick chat to make sure that everything was clear so far. And thank you for the questions, and please do keep sending them in. So what are the things that we're trying to build that will help make this this culture of reuse happen? What are the things that we're building to support it? There are two things that are out in the world already. So one is service patterns, and the other is service recipes, and we'll briefly cover those in a minute. The other ones are new things which are going to be launching this week and next week, and it's very exciting to be launching them. And they're called layers and blueprints and platforms, and these are sort of parts of wider bits of software that you can take and reuse in different ways. So let's dive into what a pattern is. So a service pattern is just a standardized way of saying what's being done for a service user. The reason why we're really interested in these, and it's not a new idea, this comes from some work that the Local Government Association did originally in categorising local government services, and then some work that FutureGov did with Essex County Council, and that we worked with FutureGov very early in 2020, in the before times, to work on service patterns and what we could do with them. We think they're important because it enables you to think about what other people are doing in their services and seeing if any of it relates to your users. So you'll recognize the sort of statement that we've got here. It's very similar to a user needs statement. As the carer of a newly diagnosed Alzheimer's patient, I need to register my change status. And the service pattern makes up these things together. So the core scale service pattern is about registering for something. The beneficiary type is the carer of a medical patient. It doesn't necessarily have to be an Alzheimer's patient. It could be a different type of patient. And the life event is receiving a diagnosis. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working with the lovely folks at Reply, so Becca Ray Evans and her team, to start categorizing these patterns across all the things that we have recipes for already. We've got some initial work on that, across all of the charities who are going through development at the moment and the wider sector as well. We won't get the complete map of the sector in the time that we're doing, but what we will be able to do is to build part of that map and then to test it with charities to see if they can describe their service in the same way. And we'll also be working with a team that I'll describe later, who will be working with the charities going through development to really use these patterns in a more strategic way. We think these patterns are super important because actually, if you're an organization who cares for different sort of medical people, you can quickly get to the recipes from organizations that have shared what they do for their medical patients. You can also think about, well, actually a new diagnosis is a change of status. And maybe I'm dealing with somebody whose status has been changed. So is there something I can learn from these services that other people have worked on? If what you know is that you just need to register someone's change status, you can drill down into all of the different services that people have created that have that as a pattern to see how they've solved that particular bit. And so we hope this will be a really good navigational way of people finding the sort of things that they can reuse that are out there. It's already in the background of the Service Recipes website. It's not exposed yet, but it will be very, very soon. We've been working on this for a little while now. And talking about recipes, for those of you who haven't come across it, service recipes are a bit of an extension of patterns in a way. When we started doing the work with FutureGov, we wanted to make the patterns instantly usable by the sector. And what we realized was that what people really needed were some step-by-step guides for how to make something just like it. And obviously that's where recipes come from. We all know that recipes are really good step-by-step guides. But as with recipes, there are lots of different ways of solving problems. And you might want to adapt some of the recipes on according to your particular tastes. And so what the recipes that we've created do is they give you enough information for you to reproduce it. They tell you a bit about who's being helped, so the service users. They give you some user needs statements, so you can see if they match up with the needs of your users. And importantly, they give you some guidance on things you need to be aware of. So that's things like safeguarding, or how to understand if somebody's in distress, or even how to support your staff members dealing with people who are in distress. So far we've published over 20 recipes. There are another 20 in the backlog. We were lucky to work with Snook and FutureGov during the early phase of the pandemic, and guided by Nissa Ramsey, understanding what the needs of the sector were and publishing recipes according to that. We felt from the feedback that we got that it was so successful that we've now turned it into a beta, and that is what we're working on currently as part of the funding from the lottery. And we're working with Charity Digital, who are now the publishing organization for recipes. They'll still stay in the service recipes site, but Charity Digital will be supporting the editorial workflow. And we're also supported in that work, as I said, by Reply, who are looking at the underlying taxonomy and the navigation. We'd really love any organization who feel they have something to share a recipe with us. We've got the editorial process down to a super quick thing where you're basically just filling in a document, and then the editorial team will turn it into something that is understandable by the audience, and will make sure that it fits in with the precise sort of structure of the recipe. It's so lovely whenever we get people telling us they've got recipes for us. It's even lovelier when people tell us that they're using a recipe. So if you find a recipe useful, please do tell us. We're going to start adding in on the website a list of the organizations who are using a recipe, so that we can start to give people an idea of how widely it's used, and to give people an idea of how other organizations might be taking it and reusing it. If you want to find out a bit more, there's a lovely podcast from Charity Digital where Hestia, who are the publishers of Being Woman, who are the publishers of a recipe, talk with Hestia, who are the consumers of a recipe. And it's well worth a listen, as it tells you actually a bit about what both organizations have gained from that particular moment of reuse. So that's recipes. So I'll now move on to the newer things. The first one of which is service layers. And so a layer is a reusable part of an application that lots and lots of organizations can reuse. And one of the first layers that we're going to be commissioning is notifications. And for this, there's the most wonderful example out in the world. So any of you who've received an email or a text alert, or even a letter from the government recently, those messages have all come to you via a system called Notify. So Notify is a uniform way for government to send these things. It's currently used by 3,500 different parts of government for different services. And since 2016, I can now update the slide, it's now sent over 2 billion messages. It's all open source, so that others can make use of the thinking in the code. And we're going to be making use of the thinking in the code. We want to build Notify for the charity sector. That's one of the briefs that will be going out this week. And we want to make it as compatible with GovUK Notify as we can, so that all of the expertise that's out there in digital agencies of integrating with Notify can also be brought into the charity sector. So reuse is something that we're doing all the time. We reuse the work from FutureGov and Essex on patterns, and we hope to reuse as much as we can from what is out there in GovUK Notify. So that's what a layer is. It's a component. It's a service that you can build other things on. Another really good example that we're putting a brief out for is around search, and geographical search in particular. So the next new thing is a blueprint. So a blueprint is where it's a complex service that's made up of lots of different parts, and some of them you might use and some of you might not use. An example of this is e-learning. There are lots of different ways to deliver e-learning material. In some case, you might want to follow a user's progress through the learning material. In other cases, you're creating a repository of that material for others to take and use in their lesson plans, for example. Now, there's lots of complexity in how these things are set up, how you design the lessons, what software you use. So we couldn't create one solution to rule them all for something like e-learning. So that's where a blueprint comes in. It's a map of all the jobs to be done, mapped to service patterns, with lots of little micro recipes associated with it that tell you how other people have solved that particular problem. And we think that blueprints are an organic thing and they'll grow over time. And hopefully there'll be things that everyone can contribute to. The first briefs to do with blueprints will be going out next week. And the third case, excuse me, is something we're calling service platforms. And a platform is where there is the opportunity to have one piece of software that can be taken and customized by many organizations. And the first thing that we're looking at for this is repositories for guidance. I should say we're being guided by the applications that come into us. So we're not just thinking, we think it would be great if, we're actually looking at all the applications that come to us. One reason for picking e-learning was that about a quarter of the applications that came in the first wave of development applications around e-learning. The reason why we're looking at guidance repositories is that about 10% of the applications this time around were for something to do with that. And a guidance repository is where organizations provide guidance to other experts. So an example of this would be an educational charity, particularly around some sort of educational special need, can provide information to other practitioners in that. Or for example, with legal aid charities, where some charities will provide guidance on, say, immigration status to lots of other legal aid charities who support people with those problems. And we think there is an opportunity to build something that will be open sourced and is probably based off a content management system, something like WordPress or Drupal, that can then be customized and configured by other organizations. And we'll talk a bit about how we want those things to be created in the next section. So I just wonder if there are any questions at this point that we have around these particular types of things.
I haven't had any. We haven't had any.
That's fine. Everyone's being very shy at the moment. Do ask questions, but I'll crack on in how we're hoping these things will be built, and we'll then have more time later on. So lots of people have principles, and somebody asked earlier about principles. We're going to talk about them as biases. So these are things that we hope will influence people's thinking when you're actually making these tools. So in a way, a lot of this is aimed at digital suppliers, but it's probably relevant to charities for them to think about when they're engaging a digital supplier. And we've tried to give them as friendly, user-readable titles as possible for the biases, but I'll go through them all now. So we want things to be openly available. So this can be a spectrum of things. So often when you talk about open, everyone thinks about open source. It has to be free at the point of getting hold of it. We think that's hugely important, but for reuse to happen, there's a thing at the other end of the spectrum, which is software as a service, where people are making their things available for you to buy on a subscription. And we think that both of these ends of the spectrum and everything in between is really useful for making things available for reuse. So what we hope is that organizations will make things at either end of those spectrums. So if you're a business and you think, I've got a product that would be great for the charity sector, just because it's not open source doesn't mean it's not something that can be reused. We want people to use stuff that's around them. Often you don't have to build too much. There's plenty lying around the internet that exists already for you to use. And so particularly in the early phase of the project, when you're testing your riskiest assumption, don't build too much. Just use what's there and tailor and support it, and then discover from that what you must build. And this is interestingly a pathway partly to sort of scalability and longevity, because it means that someone else is looking after the product roadmap. And you can always jump away from it if you find it no longer suits you, but somebody else is paying for the upkeep in lots of cases. And I've got an example of this, and actually it's with service recipes in the alpha. So when the pandemic hit, we had a clickable prototype for recipes, but we realized that it was of use to the sector for us to get it out there as quickly as possible. We were just about to do some testing with charities. And our riskiest assumptions were, will charities share recipes? Will charities read recipes? Will charities use recipes? So rather than building something super complex, we took an off-the-shelf content management system that we knew quite well called Craft CMS, and we built something in 2 weeks. And we were able then to test the recipes format out with a live audience. It felt a bit scary at times, because suddenly there's a thing that is still emergent out there in the world, and people are giving you valuable feedback to it. But actually the cost of us building it was super, super low. Now, Craft has worked really well for us. We're going into beta. We've got no plans to change from Craft during that. And I suspect that when recipes is a service that's fully live and not in alpha or beta, it'll probably still use Craft because it's a good tool. So look at what's around you and try to understand what you can use. And this is related to making as little as possible. This isn't an exhortation to the sector to be lazy at all. We know you're not. This is about only doing the things that you absolutely have to test the riskiest assumptions you have. I know as a software engineer that every line of code that I write is a dependency. Somebody's going to have to look after it over time. And so making less lines of code early on means that you're less wedded to it. You've got less of the dependency. And it makes it easier for you if you suddenly discover that you're slightly wrong in your assumptions, for you to pivot into something else. Like the more code you've written, the more process you've created, the bigger the baggage is and the harder it is to move. So make as little as possible early on. Make things that are easy for other people to get started with. So the best things for reuse are the things that require the least effort from the person who's reusing them. So when you're making something, please make it easy to deploy. You'll love yourself for that later. Make it easy to customize so others can jump straight in with it, and make it easy to use as best you can. So the things that are going to get reused the most are the things that are the easiest to pick up and use. Playing nicely with others is really our desire for people to create things that use open standards and use well-documented sort of design patterns, well-formed APIs using things like RESTful principles, so that others can actually add to them later and to create additional layers that you might not have thought about. One of my favorite things about creating open APIs is when somebody tells you they've found a use for it that you'd never thought about. An example of that are things like the Open Active API that's been supported by Sport England and incubated by the Open Data Institute. And we'll be working with other open standards and open APIs throughout the process with Catalyst. One that we're looking at the moment is Open Referral, tying up with the work that's going on currently within the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government and people like NHSX, where we're trying to build a standard collaboratively where you can find out what services different organisations provide, so you can refer vulnerable people to the right organisation at the right time. So open standards are super important, and they're the supporting framework for us building interoperability layers and meshing all of the tools together. We want things to be as consistent as they can be, and this is really a plea on the behalf of the users. So charities work with people who are most in need, who are often in dire circumstances, or who are maybe impaired in some way. And we need to work super hard to make sure that the services we create are as consistent in their user interfaces, so that people are having to use as little cognitive effort to use them as they possibly can. And we want people to think about the things they make as foundational. So something that you make for yourselves may be the building blocks that other people use. So think about how you can create parts of a jigsaw that people can take. In terms of front-end design, this suggests that we should be thinking in components. So those of you who are user experience people will understand components. Components are pieces of interface that other organizations or other parts of the software stack that you're building can take and use. So think of them as a bucket of Lego that you can make more things with. But making things in components really helps you to take things and make them more consistent across a suite of products. Finally, this is again a plea from users. Make something that's for everyone. So we need to reduce the barriers to entry as best we can by making everything that we make accessible. It's not an add-on, it's something that should just be there. We're dealing with a large number of users who have different sorts of disabilities or different abilities, and we need to make our software that we create as accessible, and that goes to the content as well. Think really carefully about reading ages and content design, English not being a first language. Try to understand the language that your service users will use, because then you don't have to worry about SEO or writing frequently asked questions. They'll be finding the software that you're creating or the services or the content you're creating in the words that they'd use to describe the problems they're looking for. We need to think about safety. We need to think about safeguarding. So always build it with the unintended consequences in mind. Think about how a bad actor would use it, and try to make sure that you're not creating anything that puts people at harm's way. And then finally, this is an interesting one. Sustainability. It's in lots of different places, this. Partly it's a plea to funders to help publish things that, to help fund things that can be more sustainable. Partly it's actually around saving the planet by not using quite so much computing resource or picking better ways to host your services. Sometimes the most sustainable thing you can do is switch something off if no one's using it. And switching things off is just part of the software life cycle and the product life cycle. So constantly think about how you might make your product sustainable. And I think I can pause here again in case there are any questions on that middle section and whether I've sort of answered some of the questions that were there earlier.
I can't see in the chat at the moment.
Excellent. Well, we'll push on through, and then we'll do a full Q&A at the end. One thing that is slightly different in the work that we're doing now with the lottery is that everything that is created as part of that process will be available as an open output. Now, this we think has a massive potential for reuse. For starters, making lots of things open and being open about it will help other people understand the process. But importantly, all the code that's created through all these development programs, all of that will be available under an open source license. All of the code that we create within Cast and Catalyst will also be available under an open source license. And all of the wonderful other things that are being created as part of this process will be available under a Creative Commons license for reuse. And this includes things such as user personas, research insights, user stories, user needs statements, acceptance tests, all of these sort of things that you may see as a byproduct of the development process. Actually, they're incredibly useful raw materials for other people to understand the process, but also for them to reuse to kickstart and to turbocharge their discovery process or their definition process. So we heard recently that actually one of the biggest problems that happens when charities dealing with issues of sexual violence engage with digital agencies is that the software that's being created deals with incredibly sensitive, incredibly distressing issues. And sometimes the software developers can't cope with working on those sorts of problems. And actually, by having a set of personas and user needs statements that's available up front as a package, then that can be handed to those developers and say, do you think you're okay with dealing with this subject area? And it will reduce the sort of problems where where software applications are sort of development is paused partway through. That's a very extreme case, but it gives you an idea about how useful these byproducts can be to other people. Never feel that something you're creating that's unique to your set of users is not useful to other people. We're not saying don't do user research anymore, of course we're not. You need to understand if it's applicable to your users, but it can give you a starting place, or it can give you some ideas for where to start testing in terms of riskiest assumption. So this is why we're asking for everything to be created under open license. And it's part of all the agreements that we send out with charities and the development agencies as part of the work we're doing that's funded by the lottery. The other thing we're asking organizations we're working with to do is to work in the open, to sort of think out loud and to create week notes that talk about what you've done that week and how it's felt and what you're doing. This is really important because one of the barriers to entry for organizations who are less digitally confident is the feeling that they're the first to do something. It's never fun to be the first to do something, but actually if other organizations have shared their progress and shared what they do and shared their fears and the things they're excited about learning, it gives you the opportunity to understand that more people have gone through this before. So working in the open is super important. We know that it's something that takes some confidence. We know that it's something that takes some help. So actually, with all the organizations going through the process, we're building some help and support for them to work in the open, for them to find their voice, to sort of talk about this stuff as they do. And actually one of the projects that I'll mention in a minute is designed to do just that sort of thing. So the support that we're providing for reuse as part of the work that's kindly funded by the lottery. So Reply as an agency are working on service patterns. If any of you would like to work with them, if you're a charity and you'd like to understand your services through the lens of the underlying patterns, I can happily connect you, or any of the other comms team can. For charities that are going through the development process, actually we're building a program with a lovely group of people. So Third Sector Lab, working with Joe and Crocstar, some of you are on the call today, thank you, which will support the charities going through that process to hopefully at the end create recipes. But in the meanwhile, to help think about the open outputs that they're creating as they go and how we can publish them effectively so that other people can use them. If you're not part of the development program, you can still publish a recipe. So Charity Digital are now the publishing partner for service recipes, and they'll be taking submissions. They already are taking submissions from charities. Get in touch with me. My details are on the slides, or you can get in touch with the Catalyst on Twitter and we'll put you in touch with Charity Digital and you can provide a recipe. As I mentioned, the layers, blueprints and platforms, they're coming really soon. That's happening this week and next week, that we'll be picking partners for that, and we'll also be selecting a delivery management partner that will help us shepherd all of those projects through. If you're interested in support around reuse of data or around whether your data can be made available to other organizations, we've formed a data collective. Over 40 charities and network bodies said they were interested in this, and DataKind are now looking after that, along with Rachel Rank, formerly the CEO of 360 Giving. So if you've got any data questions, you can go to them. And if you've got any questions around reuse and how we might support it, or you've got ideas, then please do get in touch with me. My details will be on the last slide, which we've got to. So well done, everybody. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and might have a sip of tea. So
have a sip of tea, Chris.
I'll have a sip of tea.
Take a deep breath. Lots of talking there. We've got some great questions through. From the questions that were posted earlier at the start, I feel that they're all answered. Jackie, I hope as well that you now know how you could potentially contribute to getting a recipe up about your platform. That would be great, so do get in touch. There's some questions, Chris, just at the end of the chat. One from Joe asking about how to get the board on board and open working, especially if what you're building might be income generating tool. So that would be good. I'll just tell you the questions and then you can answer them.
Yeah, totally.
How is it? Give you a little bit of a break. Rachel said, is there any documentation, any tools that can help guide building for open access that we can share, so that helps that good practice? And Stephen was saying, is there any that there might be any blind spots, like if you have a recipe when you start launching or spinning things up, that people need to be aware of, and how do you make sure they are aware of that? So not just designing or reusing the tool, but yeah, actually launching it and getting up and running.
Yep.
And then Noam, sorry, one more.
Lovely.
Noam asked about how does reuse relate to Creative Commons? Creative Commons had a simple badging system. Does reuse have a similar thing? So that's a bit more.
Okay, so I'll do them in reverse chronological order whilst they're still in my mind. Lovely question, Noam. Actually, reuse doesn't have a badging system yet. I think that might be a lovely thing, and thank you for that idea. So we will be making available sort of all of the open outputs from the work that's funded by the lottery under either an open source license, so LGPL or the Commons Clause, and all of the other open outputs will be Creative Commons, share alike, by attribution, non-commercial. But I think there's a lovely idea about creating a badging system around reuse, and a way to, one thing we'd really love, and this relates to that, is to create an economy, almost a sharing economy, where charities can say what they've used from other charities and give attribution for it. That's what we'd love to get to at some point. And we think that could have quite a profound effect on how things are funded and the sustainability of funding. But I love the idea of a badge, and we should definitely have a chat about that particular one. Super question from Stephen. There are always blind spots in these things. So one of the reasons why we're looking at putting a recipe alongside every single piece of open source content or open source software is that it then lets people know a bit more about what that particular thing does and why you might want to use it. And you're absolutely right about the sort of like the need for documentation about how to spin one of these things up. So in a way, Recipes does that. It gives you a step-by-step guide, but that's not necessarily aimed at software developers. So one of the things that we're going to be trialing with the layers and the platforms is actually the delivery management partner will be defining documentation standards for the rest of the sector to use. And it will be a first pass, and it won't be perfect, but it will be talking about how we would like these things to be documented, including all the information you need to get one going on your machine or on particular cloud hosting platforms. We know that's one of the most important things. One of the things that we didn't necessarily include in the slides because it's a bit nerdy is we really want to encourage things like 12-factor apps. So for those of you who don't know, those are things where all the configuration sits outside of the repository, and it's very neutral in terms of how you host it. We think that will make these things far more applicable and far more reusable by organizations who are maybe already in the cloud with Google or Amazon or Azure. It'd help them to spin up one of these apps in their favorite cloud hosting service or in one that is recommended by the developers. There's always a lot of missing documentation. There's normally just enough for a developer to be able to get it running again after about 3 months when they haven't touched the code for a while. But I think we've all been guilty of that. But actually what we really want is for the documentation to be so good that pretty much anybody who's ever got a piece of software working on their machine can get a development environment up and a hosting environment up with a cloud provider. It's a key part to reuse, and it's one of the barriers to open source. It's not enough to just publish the code in a GitHub repository. You've got to go a bit further And that's something that we want to provide some support and some guidance and some best practices around. So hopefully that answers that one, Stephen. The one about what if my charity isn't used to working so openly? How to explain that to my board, and then being concerned about funding competitors who might benefit from seeing what we've done. It's a really, really good question. I would say that the biggest barrier to collaboration in the sector has been the competition for funding. I think it's a problem that we need to address systemically. About commerciality, there's no reason why you can't make something open in terms of platform as a service for your competitor charities to use. If you want to be entrepreneurial with a solution you've got, if you remember, I mentioned that there are degrees of openness. One is open source and the other one is platform as a service. You could actually work with your development partner to build something that other charities could pay to use on a yearly or monthly or whatever basis. That's entirely up to you. You know, we want these things to be sustainable in lots of ways, and so why wouldn't we encourage charities to, if they wanted to and if they felt there was a market for what they were doing, to create a marketplace opportunity. In terms of talking to your board about it, it's a tricky one, this one, actually, because your board is there to make sure that you make the best use of the resources and that those resources are best used to serve your service users. That's why they're there. Now, reuse seems to be a bit of a side quest in some ways to that, but it's not. And it's not, because the more organizations who are reusing your solutions, the better those solutions will be. You've got more eyes looking at the code, you've got more user research, more insights that are going into the development, and you'll start to be building a network of charities and a peer support group that will help you make better software. Coincidentally, if other organizations reuse, you'll be able to create things and share them for reuse. You'll be able to benefit from that. So you'll be able to make better use of the funds that you've got, and you'll be able to focus those funds further and further down on the thing that makes your charity unique. Remember that blob diagram I showed earlier? The more things that are out there openly for other people to use, the more of your effort you can focus on that thing that's your speciality. Remember Julie's lovely words about sort of, I'll focus my efforts on the things that I alone have expertise for. Creating a reuse culture, and it's going to take a while, will allow you to do a lot more of that. You know, focus down on the things that matter to you and your service users, picking things off the shelf either from commercial vendors or other charities to solve all of the other parts of your digital needs. So I hope that's answered that one. It is a really hard, gnarly question, and I think, you know, over time we'll get more and more answers about it. In lots of ways it mirrors the question that we were answering about 3 or 4 years ago, which was, how do I explain to my board that we need to think about digital data and design better? You know, it's an extension of that in lots of ways. But it is interesting because it's about the wider sector in lots of ways, rather than just the sort of like the specific purpose of your charity. Are there any more?
Just checking. I think this is a direct question from Catherine to Joe. We had hoped to have some time to kind of get in smaller groups and talk, but we're running fastly out of time. But people do want to connect, especially, I don't know what the best, we might have to think about how the best way we do that. But if you're happy to share your email address in the chat, then do that, or send, is there anybody specifically, then send them a private message.
And I think, you know, this doesn't have to be the last session on this.
No,
if people would really love to have a discussion, and I'd really welcome that, then, you know, please do get in touch. We'll arrange another Zoom meeting. I'll do less of the talking, and everyone can have a sort of a more engaging session on this. You know, this is, we've taken the first steps around this. with the work we've done on recipes. And now we're looking to scale that up and looking to deal with more complex reuse. And this will evolve, and it's not just in our heads, it's in the heads of the sector. We're just trying to look at what we think the best interventions would be and getting people to come on a journey with us and shape that journey. So I would really love another session where we can talk through this more and really start to look at, you know, what other things we can do, what are the barriers that we can hopefully start to move out of the way, and how can we work as a whole ecosystem of charities, digital suppliers, funders that can create this sort of hopefully better way of delivering services to people.
There's definitely interest from the chat in having more sessions, so we might have to think about a series of sessions, and let's have a think about how we can plan them in for next year and create time in the sessions for people to also kind of share ideas and talk and explore things together, because there's a great appetite for that.
Yep, and I think that will hopefully be the seeds of a sort of a community of practice around reuse and this sort of thing, which is absolutely what we want to create here.
Great, I think we're almost at time. Just wanted to check with Cecilia if there's anything that you want to say before we go.
No, I just want to say a massive thank you for everyone for joining. It's really, really exciting. This is the first of, as Chris said, a series that we'd like to. We would have loved to be providing more opportunity for networking, but obviously I don't want to keep you any longer than 5 o'clock on an afternoon. So yeah, just thank you so much for joining, and let us know if you have any more questions. Please, I'm trying to think of the best way to get our contact details is either on the Catalyst website, or we'll put our emails in the chat as well, so you can directly message us at any questions that you have.
That's super. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's been lovely to see faces old and new in here. And as I said earlier, hopefully at some point in this year, we might be able to get together in person and have more discussions. But in the meanwhile, let's use Zoom and carry on the discussions. I've just dropped my email address in the chat, and we'll be in touch, and hopefully we'll see you all very soon.